Hello, I'm Andrew H. Waller, and thank you for viewing this presentation. I will be presenting a paper entitled Remember How He Told You, Anachrony and Narrative Rhetoric in Luke's Passion Predictions. In this paper, I will argue that the Lucan author uses anachrony in the Passion Predictions to authenticate their narrative in the mind of the audience by analeptically evoking the audience's own knowledge of Jesus' passion while proleptically predicting those same events within the narrative. By explicitly placing these analepsies in the mouth of Jesus, a trusted and divinely authenticated actor, the Lucan author accomplishes the preface's stated purpose of confidence building. Furthermore, the analeptic references to repertorial knowledge serve to refocalize the audience towards alignment with Jesus and the divine will, as opposed to the misunderstanding of the disciples. Interacting with narratology, both ancient and modern, this study will draw upon narratological definitions from ancient Greek scholia, Eric Clouston's account of ancient techniques of persuasion in the Acts of the Apostles, and James Phelan's notions of rhetorical poetics and the role of the audience in the development of narrative. Before discussing the Lucan text, I will describe what is meant by anachrony, analepsis, and prolepsis for the purposes of this paper. Anachrony refers to a narrative technique that presents events out of strict chronological sequence. This can happen via analepsis, which refers to events that have already occurred, or prolepsis, which anticipates events that have not yet occurred. For example, the proem of the Iliad proleptically alludes to the disastrous denouement of Achilles' wrath by describing the destruction of Achaean heroes and the unfolding of the will of Zeus. Similarly, the background of the Trojan War, for example, the judgment of Paris and the taking of Helen, are not narrated as part of the Iliad itself, but are rather alluded to via external analepsis, that is, a reference to past events that occur outside the scope of and are thus external to the narrative at hand. The use of anachrony can also carry with it certain effects upon the audience. In referring to an audience, I primarily intend to refer to the authorial audience, that is, an imagined audience for whom the narrative is composed. With respect to prolepsis, René Nunlist has noted that, according to the testimony of ancient Greek scholia, a prolepsis serves to hold the audience's attention and engage them emotionally. The sparser and less detailed the allusion, the greater the suspense and the level of emotional investment. Analepsis can affect an audience differently depending on the background knowledge or repertoire the audience possesses. In Aeschylus's Agamemnon, the watchman character opens the play by, among other things, cryptically referring to the history of Agamemnon's family, the house of Atreus, but refusing to recount the specifics. Quote, "The house and these old stones, what a tale they'd tell. And so would I, gladly. I speak to those who know. To those who don't, my mind's a blank. I never say a word." End quote. An audience that knows the bloody history of Agamemnon and his family will fully comprehend and anticipate the grief that is about to burst forth from the palace of Argos. However, for those who are not in the know, the watchman's analeptic allusion to the past means nothing. Thus, the effect of the analepsis and how that allusion might even proleptically hint at the outcome of the story depends, at least in part, upon a particular audience repertoire. The description in the Gospel's preface of the Lucan author's purpose in writing inherently involves issues of repertoire and analepsis. The author writes to give the audience, here referred to as Theophilus, quote, "certainty concerning the things you have been taught," end quote. Although the things that Theophilus has been taught are not described, it is possible to surmise that the audience has some understanding of early Christian traditions about Jesus. For the purpose of the analysis that follows, I suggest that the audience's repertoire should at least include a basic knowledge of the general events of Jesus' ministry and execution. Thus, the Lucan author is attempting to present a narrative that will confirm and bolster the audience's confidence in the basic knowledge that they already possess. Even at the outset of the narrative, this existing repertoire is called into mind in the preface and integrated into the audience's expectations for the rest of the narrative. I turn now to a discussion of the narrative rhetoric of the Lucan Passion predictions, understood here as Luke 9:21 through 22, 9:43b through 45, and 18:31 through 34. These are sayings in which Jesus specifically references his lethal fate of crucifixion in Jerusalem. The saying in 9:22 constitutes the first unambiguous reference to Jesus' execution. Following Peter's identification of Jesus as the Christ of God, Jesus says that, quote, "The Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised." End quote. Following the Transfiguration episode, Jesus reasserts this prediction in Luke 9:44, saying, quote, "Let these words sink into your ears, for the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men." End quote. Finally, in Luke 18:31, just as Jesus is about to enter Jerusalem, he states that, quote, "Everything that is written about the Son of Man by the prophets will be accomplished," end quote, and proceeds to once again predict his execution and his resurrection in detail. Note that each prediction utilizes information that would have been a part of the audience's repertoire. It is difficult to imagine that an audience that had received the early Christian traditions in the way that the Lucan preface describes would also be unfamiliar with these sorts of basic descriptions of Jesus' death and resurrection. Although the Passion predictions are utterly proleptic from the perspective of the disciples, they can be read as analepsies from an audience-oriented perspective. The disciples react to each Passion prediction with misunderstanding. For the disciples, the Passion sayings are a source of tension that will not be released until after the resurrection. This differs significantly from the likely reaction of an audience that has been versed in traditions about Jesus. The Lucan audience would already be aware of the events that Jesus predicts, and the predictions themselves, particularly upon repetition, would recall the context of that repertorial knowledge via external analepsis. This analeptic repertorial engagement allows the audience to comprehend and interpret Jesus' fate where the disciples cannot. For most of the Galilean narratives, the audience has likely identified with the disciples. The actions of following Jesus and receiving his teaching make the disciples a natural locus of focalization for the audience. However, the initial reference to the disciples' misunderstanding in Luke 9:45 disrupts this. The audience is now in the know in a way that the disciples cannot be at this point in the narrative. As Jesus progresses towards Jerusalem, the audience is increasingly aligned with Jesus' understanding of his own fate and the unfolding of the divine will, rather than the perspective of the disciples. The barrier of misunderstanding defocalizes the audience from the disciples, and their own repertorial knowledge refocalizes them towards Jesus himself. Furthermore, the Lucan iteration of the saying in 1831 goes beyond its parallels in the other synoptics in terms of its potential rhetorical impact upon the audience. The unique Lucan reference to the prophets solidifies the connection to repertorial knowledge and encourages the audience to engage their own potential memories of the Jewish prophets, even as the text narrates the fulfillment of that same prophetic material. In this way, the Lucan iteration of this saying is engaged with audience repertoire in a way that the other synoptics are not. It is also important to consider which character is speaking these predictions. In all three instances, we find Jesus predicting his own death and resurrection. Eric Clouston's recent survey of ancient techniques of persuasion in the Acts of the Apostles has noted that ancient narratives may either accredit or discredit characters within the story. An accredited character is one that has been portrayed positively in some way. The audience is typically led to regard these accredited characters as trustworthy, while the opposite can be said of discredited characters. Portrayal of characters as supernatural or divine can be an effective form of accreditation. Examples from the narrative of Acts are characters such as Stephen or Paul, who are explicitly divinely accredited by miracles or other supernatural affirmations. In the narrative of the Gospel, Jesus clearly fits the category of an accredited character, particularly given the baptism scene in Luke 3 and the various miracles performed prior to the first passion prediction in Luke 9. Clouston also notes that accredited characters can accredit or discredit others. However, I would like to suggest that in the passion predictions, it is not another character that Jesus accredits, but rather the audience themselves. Hearing the audience's own repertorial knowledge of Jesus' fate repeated by Jesus himself in a straightforward, authoritative, and even prophetic manner has the rhetorical effect of persuading the audience that what they know about Jesus' passion is not merely the product of the traditions mentioned in the preface. Rather, by analeptically recalling the audience's own knowledge of Jesus and placing that analepsis in the mouth of a prominent, accredited character, the Lucan narrative confirms that what the audience knows about Jesus' death and resurrection is a divinely accredited fact. This extends beyond a mere allusion to repertorial knowledge. Here, Jesus' words are used to confirm for the audience the things they have been taught, and thus accomplish the Lucan purpose as stated in the Gospel's preface. This rhetorical denouement is confirmed by the final specific reference to Jesus' passion in Luke 24, 6 through 9. The women at the tomb encounter two angelic men who say, quote, "Remember how he told you, while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the third day rise." End quote. The men restate Jesus' own descriptions of the crucifixion in an analeptic mode. The audience is invited, along with the women, to remember how he told you, which prompts not only reflection on the passion sayings within the narrative that has just been related, but also memories of the telling that has occurred outside the narrative in the form of repertorial knowledge. Construed this way, the tradition of the Christian church becomes integral to this act of remembering. Indeed, the women returning to the tomb and relating their experience to the other disciples in verses 8 and 9 effectively completes the communicative loop that connects the Lucan narrative itself with the tradition of the things Theophilus has been taught from the preface. One possible objection to what I am suggesting is that reading the passion predictions as anachrony complicates our understanding of the narrative unnecessarily. Why not regard the passion predictions as simple allusions to audience repertoire? It could be argued that the idea of a simultaneous external analepsis and internal prolepsis brings confusion rather than clarity. Surely the rhetorical effects of confirming audience knowledge about Jesus' passion can be acknowledged without drawing upon the concept of an external analepsis. It is true that what I have described as analepsis is, at its core, an illusion. However, I would suggest that the terminology of analepsis more precisely captures the experience of the reader when this information is encountered within the narrative. An audience with the sort of repertoire I have described would not experience the passion predictions as mere illusions, or even mere prolepsies. Rather, such an audience would engage in their own memory of the things they have been taught, which constitutes a remembered, traditioned, and experienced text in its own right that is external to the narrative of the gospel. This readerly dynamic and its impact upon the development of the narrative is not adequately captured by the language of allusion alone. The chronological dimension of anachrony and the simultaneous forwardness and backwardness of the Passion predictions is valuable for our understanding of the readerly experience of these passages. I suggest that this acknowledgement of readerly experience coincides with James Phelan's account of rhetorical poetics. Phelan asserts that, quote, texts are designed by authors to affect readers in particular ways. Those authorial designs are conveyed through the words, images, techniques, elements, structures, forms, and dialogic relations of texts, as well as the conventions readers use to understand them. And those designs are also deeply influenced by the nature of their audiences and their activity in responding to the unfolding communication. End quote. What I have described in this paper is an attempt to follow Phelan's lead in being mindful of the response of the audience to the communication of the third gospel, and how an anticipation of that response might shape authorial activity. The analysis outlined here is one way of acknowledging the rhetorical impact of the Passion predictions on the Lucan audience in light of an assumed repertoire and their anticipated response on the basis of that repertoire. Some ancient critics would have likely regarded the Gospel's use of repeated and increasingly specific proleptic references to Jesus' death as ineffective and rhetorically blunt, especially for a rhetorical audience with knowledge of the basic events of Jesus' death. However, although perhaps out of step with other ancient uses of prolepsis, I maintain that this series of predictions bears out its rhetorical effectiveness in analepsis rather than prolepsis. The rhetorical thrust of these predictions does not lie in narrative tension introduced via prolepsis. Rather, the Lucan author is consciously using the anticipated response of the audience to analeptic repertorial references to accomplish the persuasive goal of strengthening the confidence of the audience in the things they have been taught. In conclusion, the confirmatory purpose outlined in the Lucan preface is not accomplished through mere narration of plot points. Instead, the Gospel sets out to build upon the foundation of an existing repertoire by strengthening the audience's confidence in the knowledge that they already possess. The Lucan Passion predictions clearly involve such a repertoire, if indeed the audience holds a basic amount of knowledge concerning the events of Jesus' death and resurrection. The references to Jesus' death and resurrection constitute external analepsies, causing the audience to recall their own knowledge and memory of early Christian traditions about Jesus. Furthermore, by placing these analepsies in the mouth of Jesus, a trustworthy and accredited character, the Lucan author confirms the truth of that repertoire in the mind of the audience, thus persuasively moving the audience towards the desired state of confidence, as expressed in the Lucan preface. Highlighting the presence of this analeptic rhetoric in the Lucan Passion predictions is an attempt to take into account readerly experience and encounter, especially as it relates to the unfolding of the Gospel's rhetorical purpose, as outlined in the preface. Thank you for listening.